Thank you so very much. Now you know a lot about me. I hope that we get a chance to speak afterwards. I'll get to know more of you a little bit better as well. It's such a great opportunity to be able to share my work with you and to talk about the book, which is really represents in some ways the culmination of my life's work so far. I spent at least 10 years working with human rights NGOs, so if at times I sound like I'm critiquing or observing from within, that's partly true. That's part of where I've come from to get to this point. I want to thank Meta and Science for Peace so very much for this opportunity. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming out. My talk tonight is about human rights movements in Colombia, concretely in the oil capital of Colombia, historic oil capital called Barrancabermeja. Or as it's popularly known, simply Barranca, and that's how I'll usually refer to it. You may have read something in the newspaper, perhaps the Toronto Star or the New York Times, that Colombia is a great place to visit now, that it is a place where the tourists have returned. You may have read, if you dug a little bit deeper, that they are negotiating peace after 51 years of fighting and counting between the Colombian state and the main rebel group in Colombia, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, who have been at arms under that name since 1965. This is a huge, momentous occasion for Colombian society. Many hopes are resting on this process. Originally, the peace process was meant to culminate on the 23rd of March. So that's, if I'm not mistaken, in about, a week's time or so. Now they're saying they will not reach that deadline, but as they race to the finish, they are trying to get a whole lot of work done, and they don't intend, at this point at least, to turn back. Which means that there's a lot of stake in the study of history, in the way in which Colombians evaluate and think about their own history. I'm a historian, and the project that I've undertaken is to try and understand where human rights come from. Beyond the traditional stories told about institution building, about laws, about Geneva and New York City and Washington, where do the people who put into practice human rights, in a conflict zone in this case, where do they draw strength from? What examples do they use, and what kinds of practices constitute human rights practices for them? You know, one of the great challenges in writing the history of human rights in Latin America, in Colombia, or perhaps for anywhere else that matter, is to make sense of what may seem to outside observers, and indeed many victims, as a litany of tragic events. A couple of years ago, I was corresponding with a friend in Colombia, explaining to her that the book was coming out. I'd completed my PhD, I was moving to Toronto, and she responded full of warmth and congratulations. But at the end of her email, she wrote the following quite sober reflection. She wrote, "Here we are still living the worst sort of monotony in the universe. Deaths, accidents, accusations, misery. This is our daily bread." The small industrial enclave of Barrancabermeja, in which she lives, Colombia's oil refining capital today, has been the site of about 5,000 execution-style killings, carried out mainly by the Colombian military, police, and right-wing paramilitaries, as well as leftist insurgent groups, over just about a 20-year period of time. It's a city of about 300,000. The toll is absolutely devastating, and you can understand perhaps a little bit of where she's coming from. And it reminded me that people who do this kind of history or do this kind of research really confront a kind of twofold challenge. On the one hand, to honestly and respectfully represent the complexity of the human costs of armed conflict. You can't just leave the violence out completely. It's an important part of the story and the way in which people have come to think about their own lives. It's a very critical reference point. But on the other hand, we have to move beyond the litany of disaster and into the realm of interpretation. My book, The Social Origins of Human Rights, published last year, embraces this challenge and a social historical approach to the study of human rights. My main preoccupation as a historian is the advent of human rights movements in the latter half of the 20th century in Latin America. These human rights movements, which emerged mainly in the 1970s and 1980s in response to the rise of right-wing dictatorships, militarism, and civil conflict, I believe should be understood with respect to prior forms of social activism. When we do this, we can see that human rights movements are in some sense a reconfiguration of past struggles that were themselves very diverse. This bottom-up approach allows us to read human rights from an activist point of view as a form of social protest or a paradigm of social protest. So the first slide is just to make a kind of general theoretical point. I won't delve too deep into the theory of human rights history, but I wanted to at least start with this. You know, it's been stated that human rights violation is a category for making violence socially and politically legible. It gives us a vocabulary for understanding violence. It helps to establish legal accountability, and it also can help us to locate specific acts in their specific histories, or indeed in broader histories. Amnesty International, the United Nations, Human Rights Watch, the Department of Foreign Affairs, none of these organizations or institutions that work with human rights frameworks would have an analysis of Colombia or the conflicts in the Democratic Republic of Congo or any other place for that matter where the violence seems so complex as to be, you know, inscrutable, difficult to understand, opaque. They wouldn't have analysis except for the work done by frontline human rights defenders like the ones I interviewed for my book. On this last point, however, I'd caution that the contentious politics that have given rise to human rights movements in Colombia and elsewhere can often be eclipsed by the violence that they themselves are recounting. Their initial sources of motivation, their initial origins, their social origins can sometimes really just be overtaken by, again, this litany of disaster. Now, as I said before, we can't leave the violence out. We can't decouple the narratives of atrocity that these human rights organizations produce in their reports, which are extremely important, you know, from the way in which these movements operate. But we should take a moment to critically look at how, why, and with what impact people organize collectively around human rights. Today, I'm going to show you a little bit about what I hope historians can bring to bear on the debate around human rights. The few historians writing in the field of human rights have thus far mainly offered kind of broad syntheses, you know, histories of human rights throughout the ages, with varying interpretations. They sometimes, as I said before, focus on the drafting of laws, the building of institutions like the UN. I really want to shift our focus to the activities of social justice advocates, many of whom were engaged in struggles that foreshadowed this global human rights revolution since the 1970s. In both content, in the things they said, and also in form, in the ways in which they acted, the things that they did. Colombia. Colombia, as I've already said, is now at the end of its 5th decade of an armed conflagration that most people simply refer to as the conflict, el conflicto. The guerrillas in Colombia, who are negotiating now with the Colombian state, were born in the mid-1960s, at the height of the Cold War. They were inspired both by local traditions of popular resistance and by the Cuban Revolution. Through the latter half of the 20th century, Colombia's 2 major political parties actually shut out opposition voices through a combination of violent repression, emergency legal measures, and a bipartisan power-sharing agreement that they called the National Front. The leftist guerrillas' influence grew through this period, especially into the 1980s, as frustration with conventional politics persisted. The two parties in question, by the way, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party, agreed to run presidential candidates unopposed every election cycle, meaning that there was almost no chance for a third party or new initiatives to come forth. Now, while a number of smaller insurgent groups have disbanded and sued for peace over the years, the two main ones, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC, and the Army of National Liberation, or the ELN, remained at arms and remain at arms today. In response to the challenge posed by the guerrillas, the Colombian military aided and abetted the deployment of right-wing paramilitary forces to carry out covert operations against guerrilla sympathizers, perceived guerrilla sympathizers, and indeed social activists of various descriptions, as well as peasant movements and a variety of new social movements that were coming up at the same time, many of whom shared some of the aspirations of the guerrillas in terms of transforming society, but not their methods. Beginning in the 1980s, army officials worked directly with drug traffickers to set up death squads in the countryside. The very first experiments in this particular form of paramilitarism were launched just south of the city of Barrancabermeja, or Barranca, which is indicated on the map with the blue circle and the red arrow. The blue circle is meant to indicate the region that Barrancabermeja is located in, known as the Middle Magdalena River Valley. Barrancabermeja, by the way, is Colombia's historic oil capital. I have said, as I've already said, it refines most of Colombia's oil production for gasoline, jet fuel, and other industrial products, and has been a major industrial center since the beginning of the 20th century. So just to give you a few images of Barrancabermeja as we continue to talk, that's a picture of the refinery in Barrancabermeja, where, as I said, most of Colombia's oil is currently refined, and that has been in continuous operation since 1922, when it was built by Standard Oil. And I'll get back to that in a second. As the paramilitary groups I was describing established themselves, security forces, military, Navy, and police, began also to carry out their own direct covert operations in the region around Barrancabermeja, and then increasingly in the city itself. This is through the 1980s. The guerrillas, in the meanwhile, pursued a really parallel strategy of military expansion in this same period of time, fueled by the extortion of profits from cattle ranching and from the drug trade. By the end of the 1990s, the guerrillas were about 30,000 fighters strong, and the paramilitary groups claimed to be about 20,000 fighters strong at this point. Although their stated mission, that of the paramilitaries, was counterinsurgency, they usually targeted any persons that they considered to be their ideological enemies. In the context of this particular place, which was in the 1990s the most violent city in Colombia, it's a city of 300,000 at this point, they were targeting mainly social activists, trade unionists, and displaced peasants who were living in the slums of the city, perceived to be refugees from guerrilla-controlled areas and therefore suspected of supporting the guerrillas. Now, just to take a moment to show you a couple of other images of Barrancabermeja to get you a sense of what we're talking about and where we're located. On the left of the screen is a picture of the Cristo Petrolero, which could be translated as the oil Christ, or Christ the oil worker. And it is a 26-meter high ironwork statue that actually it lights up at night, and it actually spouts water in huge streams out of its hands. Just located in front of the Cristo Petrolero, which is In front of the marsh that juts up against the refinery, there's actually a kind of boardwalk where young lovers and friends can walk hand in hand in the light of the refinery at night in Barrancabermeja. It is really the only place to kind of peacefully pass the time in the whole city. And now they've constructed a kind of, I guess, sculpture park filled with smaller ironwork sculptures of different animals from the local forests all along the bottom, but yet that don't come into that picture.
Nobody has been shot in that part, is it?
I beg your pardon?
Nobody has been shot in that part?
Oh, I wouldn't say for sure that nobody's been shot in that part, but it's a special place, let's put it that way. On the right here of the screen, there's actually a photograph taken from one of the taller buildings in the city of an explosion resulting from the sabotage of an oil pipeline. The act of sabotage in question was committed in the name of the ELN, or the Army of National Liberation, one of the two guerrilla groups in the region. And they were doing this to make a particular point, meeting in this building that you see here. At that very moment were several Colombian cabinet ministers with members of peasant communities that had gone to the city of Barrancabermeja to protest conditions in the countryside, violence, poverty, lack of credit, lack of access to markets, all the normal kinds of things that peasants protest, and to demonstrate some kind of presence, I guess. The ELN guerrillas blew up the pipeline at that particular moment. It's a fairly common way in which they interact with the public kind of sphere. It's a very important tactic, if you will, that has been used by the ELN over the years. Through the course of this presentation, I'm going to do a few things. First of all, I want to narrate or tell you the story of the painful and adrenaline-fueled birth of a human rights movement in Barrancabermeja at the height of violence, in the first wave of violence in the late 1980s. Then I want to reflect a little bit on the possibilities and limitations of using human rights reporting, as a primary source, as a historian, and then delve into a little bit more of the historical background behind Barrancabermeja's long past as the cradle of trade union and social movement activism in Colombia since really the early 20th century. So I won't go over the allotted time, but do make yourselves comfortable. And by the way, of course, if you have something to add to the conversation, by all means, please do. I'm more than happy. So first now, the genesis of human rights movements in Barrancabermeja. In 1987, the murder of a 14-year-old girl prompted the first general strike in Colombian history in favor of human rights. There had been other general strikes. This was the first one at a regional level in favor of human rights explicitly. 14-year-old Sandra Rondon was actually witness to a grenade attack on 3 members of the leftist political party, the Patriotic Union, about a week prior to her murder. The Patriotic Union, a political party formed in the mid-1980s with formal links to the guerrillas. It was meant to be part of a demobilization strategy that went very, very wrong, as several thousand members of the Patriotic Union ended up being killed, and both sides armed themselves during the process of negotiation, and the eventual negotiations fell off. Really, as the FARC were negotiating this accord, and the Patriotic Union was coming into power, or contesting politics for the first time, you saw the radical increase of paramilitarism for the first time, really simultaneously. In any case, it was actually at a crowded ice cream shop in central Barrancabermeja called Monte Blanco that Sandra Rondon was sitting with her brother when a grenade was thrown at the table of 4 members of the Patriotic Union. Nobody was killed, but a number of people were badly injured, including Sandra's brother. Several days later, having been identified in the media as a witness to the attack, Sandra Rondon was shot multiple times at close range while on her way to church on a Sunday afternoon. Her murder galvanized a broad cross-section of society, both in Barrancabermeja and to some extent across the country. Eventually, editorialists, political leaders would weigh in on the situation in Barrancabermeja, but they did so partly in response to a massive outpouring of protest. In fact, the general strike that ensued, which lasted about 5 days and involved tens of thousands of people taking control of the city, was the biggest demonstrations that this town, which was already a hotbed of activism, had ever seen. At these protests, elected officials made themselves present, so to be seen and to partake and support the action. So too did all kinds of community groups, and indeed so too did the guerrillas, waving flags, sometimes armed, present at the demonstrations to protest Sandra Rondon. And thus, Barrancabermeja's human rights movement was born, really rife with divergent interests and contested kind of meanings. Peasant organizations, interestingly, at the time, who were actually the first to sound the alarm that massive violations were taking place in the countryside before these kinds of things were happening in the city itself, were also the first to actually question whether or not protesting for basic human rights offered a way forward. An historic mobilization of peasants was being planned at the very same time as this general strike. It was called the Paro del Nororiente, or the Strike of the Northeast. It was conceived as a kind of mass exodus where tens of thousands of peasants would abandon the countryside and go to regional cities and regional capitals and make their presence known, occupy public parks and such, and set up shantytown protests around the region. And this had been in the works for months and months and months. So at the time of Sandra Rondon's murder, there was an active debate as to whether or not carrying out this protest for simple human rights was going to be a distraction from the more important, longer-term class struggle that was at stake in peasant movement, in the view of peasants. And they also worried, of course, about burning out their membership if they partook in both, and of burning out their hosts, all the people that would essentially welcome them to the towns and the cities in the area when they abandoned the countryside. In the end, however, to make a much longer story short, both protests did take place. Peasant movements did partake in both, and civic urban activists partook in both the peasant protests as well as the human rights protest. In the year following Sandra Rondon's murder, activists in Barrancabermeja would organize 8 more paros cívicos, or civic strikes, citizen-led general strikes, in favor of human rights explicitly, 8 more times in 12 months. Now, just to explain a little bit about the map that you're seeing for a couple of moments here, you get the general idea that the city has been built up pretty much exclusively on the eastern banks of the Magdalena River in Colombia, which is Colombia's St. Lawrence, or Colombia's Mississippi, the main artery of river transportation and communication in the country. What I've done to this map is I've indicated by the means of this red line here the train track that cuts the city in two. On the left side is the planned city built up with the proceeds of the oil industry, which is now, by the way, in state hands, mainly state hands, or government controlled. And the right side of the screen represents all the neighborhoods built up through processes of land invasions, mostly by IDPs or internally displaced people, who came to settle in Barrancabermeja either in search of work or indeed to take shelter from violence in the countryside. The red stars, which you see here, here, and here, are meant to indicate areas of guerrilla militia concentration in the city, where they were actually, at this point in time in the 1980s, a presence of armed leftist insurgents inside the city itself. And the blue stars are the military bases in the city. There are, if you count them, 1, 2, 3, 4 military bases, 5 actually, if you include, there's a naval checkpoint at the top of the screen on the left as well. And of course the oil barrels kind of, if you'll pardon the pun, kind of crudely show you where the actual oil is located. It's interesting to note that there's a counterinsurgency battalion located, actually 2, located right at the oil refinery, whose sole purpose is the defense of the oil refinery from guerrilla attacks. So in Barrancabermeja, following the murder of Sandro Rondon, people would set up barricades and that, to block the access to the city and halt all transportation in order to make this idea of a general strike effective, right? And the green crosses along the train tracks illustrate the exact locations where the barricades have traditionally been set up. And I should say, since the 1960s, these green places, all of which have special names in the folklore of the city, are exactly the same places where barricades are set up, even to this day, to protest either human rights violations or access to social services or other demands made on the part of social movements. So that's the general gist of that map. So right after Sandro Rondon's murder and the general strike that ensued, a team comprised of individuals from 23 different unions and community groups would come together to form a committee to document and denounce human rights violations on an ongoing basis. They were called the Regional Committee for the Defense of Human Rights, or Kratos. The leadership of Colombia's largest peasant organization, called ANUC, based in Barrancabermeja, one of the regional kind of, I guess, factions of ANUC was based in Barrancabermeja. They were participants in it. The Oil Workers Union established their own human rights committee and their own human rights work, comprised of community organizers, interestingly, not actual oil workers, because they wanted people who could go out into the community and actually do human rights work on another basis that was perhaps outside of the scope of the usual concerns of the union around wages and working conditions. A women's organization called the OFP, or the Popular Women's Organization, was founded the same year, and they went out into communities to do human rights work. And a Jesuit-led NGO out of Bogota would establish itself in Barrancabermeja that same year to set up a shelter for displaced peasants, also in the name of human rights. Historian Mauricio Archila of Colombia has shown that by 1988, human rights would become the #1 reason for social mobilization in Colombia and would remain so more or less for the next decade. Human rights would also become the way in which the international community viewed the Colombian conflict and an important basis upon which Colombian politics itself were debated or contested. So I would just take a moment here really quickly to open some parentheses and explain that there were also kind of precedents to the human rights work being done in 1987 in Barrancabermeja. As early as the early 1960s, forward-looking scholars in the sociology department at the National University in Bogota partnered with Catholic priests and others to put together the first serious study of the origins of violence in Colombia. Some of those individuals would become hugely influential in the creation of human rights committees and organizations in Bogota over the next 3 decades. But I don't want to go too deeply into that story, except to say that by the early 1960s, Colombia was dealing with the aftermath of a previous civil war that they called La Violencia, or the violence, where an estimated 200,000 people had died. And so that was the experience upon which those sociologists and others were reflecting at that point. but the tools they developed, the kind of methods they used for really going out into the communities to find out what was going on, would really inspire people like the people in Kratos 2 decades later. Anyway, back quickly to the contestation of politics in Colombia. This is, by the way, a quotation from the former Secretary General of the organization Kratos, who I interviewed in 2006. And he's reflecting on the spirit, if you will, of kind of popular democracy that he experienced in those days of the big general strikes in Barrancabermeja for human rights. You can read it for yourself, but I'll read you at least the first part because it's so rich. He said to me, you know, we all took risks. We were a bit irresponsible. We were young, totally convinced of what we were doing. We didn't sleep, but it was happiness. This was the best training we had as young people. He's talking about being in the street all day, all night, keeping the city at a standstill to protest the violence. Then I went to university, he adds, and I got a degree in human rights, but my basic training took place in the street. So it's an excellent, excellent quotation. Now, in recent Colombian history, one of the main political debates has been waged between, hey, welcome, people who are concerned with the degree to which the state and paramilitary groups act together or autonomously. This is kind of one of the major political debates of Colombia of the last 20th century. In response to this kind of very polarizing debate in Colombia about whether or not the state itself is responsible for paramilitarism, armed forces and government leaders have frequently shot back that anyone who defends human rights must be doing so because they are a front for the guerrillas, which has created enormously complex situations in terms of threats against human rights workers. Francisco Campos has taken exile out of the city of Barrancabermeja a number of times, specifically fleeing threats. Often, though, what's left out of the clamor, and what's left out of all the flurry of urgent actions that you might receive if you were tuned into the networks of human rights working on Colombia, is the history of social and economic justice that is also at stake, or what some of these pioneering activists believed they were actually doing, what values they were actually defending. In the context of constant pressure on activists to demonstrate that they are in fact not a rearguard strategy of insurgent groups, it's hardly surprising that the public record produced by many of these human rights defenders is often limited to a kind of register of violent acts. And if you look at the reports of Kratos and other groups, you see that's what they mostly do, right? It's almost like a catalog of human rights abuses. Colombian human rights defenders also became caught in a reactive mode, struggling to keep up with this real juggernaut of intimidation and attacks. The first generation of activists associated with this organization, Kratos, was all exiled or killed, every single one of them. And none of them remain in the city. 6 people were killed in the first 3 years of forming the Committee for Human Rights. In one of our meetings, the very first president of Kratos, a guy named Jorge Gomez, who's a human rights and labor lawyer, founding president of Kratos, really lamented to me that in the first years of their work, they had no time to analyze or write anything analytically. They were just constantly trying to stem the hemorrhaging of the civil society movements that were under pressure from paramilitary. Too much time spent in the streets or taking victim statements, and really not enough time to do any reflection. Gomez suggested that the work of really going through the Kratos Archives deeply, in fact, still needs to be done. I personally worked with the Kratos Archives. I can tell you that it's also a very endangered archive. They have many boxes, probably in the realm of 40 boxes of legal documents and reports and meeting minutes that are mostly in the process of decomposition due to the the very humid weather that exists in this tropical lowland area. I've been in touch with them recently, and they're just starting now to get some interns from the public university to try and at least organize their files. But we're looking to try and see if we can actually get a grant to properly store and maybe even digitize them for their own use. Though it's not going to happen overnight. I recognize that this is kind of part of the historical project I'm trying to take on myself. Now, just to give you a little sense of, in the few minutes that we have left to continue this, this discussion about the specific history of Barrancabermeja, and in fact what people believed was at stake, as I said earlier. Let me say that the details and the killings of the massacres that have been recorded and published and denounced by groups like Kratos, the Oil Workers Union, peasant movements, and others who were part of this larger, broader human rights struggle at the time, are key to the social memories of the people who participated in the movement for human rights. But really the most important stories in my work have had to do with the stories of the protests themselves, or how people got organized, sort of the tactics and the strategies they used, and how they actually got their act together to get tens of thousands of people into the street. Time and again, I was told that by human rights defenders that in this very special place where anti-authoritarian politics, where rebellion were the norm, or at least romanticized, that throwing rocks, this is a direct quotation from a young man I interviewed, throwing rocks at the police was an important part of growing up. That's what he told me. My education took place in the street, as Francisco Campos stated. Or one of my all-time favorite quotes from a woman who was a nun and a school teacher, she simply said, "This town doesn't belong to the rich." And by that she meant it's a place of popular politics. It wasn't always a place of popular radical leftist politics, but nonetheless of some form of popular democracy. In the book, I trace the history of popular protest in the city, and from the creation and development of Barranca as an oil enclave by Jersey Standard in the 1920s, through the process of nationalization of the oil industry in Barrancabermeja in the 1950s, culminating in 1961, the onset of guerrilla warfare in the 1960s, the subsequent use by military courts to crush the Oil Workers Union, court-martialing oil workers for going on strike. I mean, this was common practice until the 1980s. And the eventual takeover of the city by right-wing paramilitaries in the early 2000s. So the oil wealth that flows through Barranca has long made it a pole of attraction for migrants from all over the country and beyond. As we know, oil economies can boom and bust as wells are emptied and investments shift, but their relationship to oil is different because it has had this, since 1922, the continuous operation of an oil refinery, which is now again under state control. So it both has a very particular relationship to oil and a particular relationship to the central state, which is somewhat unique in Colombian history. And now I'll run through these a little more quickly, just to give you a general sense of this broader sweep of history. This is a page from The Lamp, which is the Standard Oil, the newspaper that they would have sent to shareholders from 1924, describing the building of a pipeline from Barrancabermeja to Cartagena on the coast. And I'll narrate some of this story now as I show you these slides. So the Tropical Oil Company was a subsidiary of Standard Oil, the largest petrochemical company the world has ever seen, now called ExxonMobil. They built a refinery that's been in continuous operation since 1922. This fact has meant there have been a few thousand relatively well-paid jobs in the city for all that period of time. But the workers, despite being relatively well paid, have been subject to arbitrary treatment throughout this period of time by the oil company and also by security-obsessed national authorities. Also important, if you think back to the map we saw earlier of the city where I said most people live, right? The part of the city that's mostly land invasions and slums. The vast majority of migrants who went to Barrancabermeja in search of work in the oil business did not get work in the oil business. So they were left in the service industries, in construction trades, and in day laboring. More than just the outcome of the contradictions of foreign investment, social conflict in Barranca during the tropical oil era occurred within a volatile political context. In the 1920s, there was growing frustration in Colombia after 2 decades of conservative rule over the exclusion of many citizens from meaningful participation in politics. One of the outcomes of this was the rise of a new populist option in Colombia. Those of you who are students of Colombian history or know Colombian history will recognize the name of Jorge Eliezer Gaitan. Gaitan was a lawyer from a modest family from Bogota, importantly mestizo, dark-skinned. He was a rapid rising populist star of the left wing of the Liberal Party, and he really distinguished himself from what he would have described as the country club politics of the hierarchy of the Liberal Party. He'd been amongst the first to denounce the 1928 banana workers massacre in Santa Marta, which was made famous in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. And he worked extensively to gain support amongst the oil workers of Barrancabermeja. There's an anecdote that when he returned from his tour of the banana zone in Santa Marta following the massacre, he actually, he went up the Magdalena River in a boat and stopped in front of the wharf in Barrancabermeja in the river. And people were so moved by what he had to say that they threw themselves into the river so they could try and get closer to him and maybe shake his hand. Anyway, he was killed, to make a very complicated story short, he was killed in 1948. And in response to his murder, popular radicals and liberals in Barrancabermeja mounted an armed uprising. It was known as the Commune of Barrancabermeja, or the Commune of Barranca. It was crushed, most of its leaders jailed, and the city tightly policed over the next decade in a show of solidarity, rare show of solidarity between the liberal and conservative parties who were actually at war with each other at this point in time. Across the country, there had really been unleashed violent forces, but in Barrancabermeja they agreed to put their differences aside for the sake, perhaps, of oil. Anyway, during the next, after peace was signed in 1958, they entered into this National Front pact, and as I described earlier, this had the impact of excluding many people from politics. To reinforce the point, between 1958 and 1978, Colombian human rights attorney Gustavo Gallon has estimated that no fewer than 300 state of siege declarations were made by the Colombian government. During the next few years, Barrancabermeja would actually cast off of its identity as a kind of company town as internally displaced peasants, now increasingly under pressure from a counterinsurgency operation in the countryside, went to the city to demand recognition from the national government, which in this particular case happened to be right there because the oil company was now there, and to uphold basic human rights. As I said earlier, the Oil Workers Union itself was weakened during the 1970s, and many of its leaders court-martialed and banned from the city. And it is into this void, if you will, that a number of displaced people, women's organizations, progressive church movements step and form new social movements that would become the basis upon which human rights were now going to be organized in Barrancabermeja. The wider context that gives rise to human rights activism can be linked really also to international politics, and we don't have time to get into that, but by the end of the 1980s, Colombia would see the drug war taking off and a massive increase of military spending in the country, increased pressure on the oil company to privatize parts of its interests, which was opposed violently by the guerrillas and opposed through strikes by the Oil Workers Union. And rather than stick to the script, I do want to now show you the rest of my slides and get right into any kind of conversation that you'd like to have. Now, as I said, the Barrancabermeja was really a central kind of area for human rights. Not before it was a human rights center, a center for social movement organizing. These are images of a general strike in Barrancabermeja in 1963, and there's a number of things which are really noteworthy about this photograph, which was taken by a photographer named Joya, who was sort of the unofficial photographer of the union movement and the social movements in the city for about 25 years. One is obviously the very orderly, well-dressed protesters, right? Not the rabble that perhaps the oil workers were sometimes described as by the state or by the oil company itself. But the other thing is, if you look at the top of the screen, this is like the main street of Barrancabermeja. You'll notice that there's a fenced-off area. And so even in 1963, after nationalization, there was a kind of social apartheid that existed in Barrancabermeja. And that area of the city was a no-go zone to anyone who was not officially employed by the company. In fact, the mayor of Barrancabermeja, this is now in 1971, I interviewed one of the former mayors of the city, who actually was a member of the Conservative Party, although he had to kind of toe the radical line anyway, even though, you know, I mean, those are hammer and sickle flags that they're carrying. He had to toe the radical line even though he was a member of the Conservative Party. He told me that if he wanted to go and talk to a director of the oil company, he needed to get special written permission and before he could cross the security gate to do so.
Don't we have social apartheid areas in America today?
Oh, I wouldn't argue with you. I would not argue with you. Yeah. It was a stark reality of life for people, though, literally, as they're staring at these fences, as it is in perhaps other parts of the world today. One of the responses of people to this context was to establish self-built neighborhoods through what we would describe as land invasions or occupations of land. And this is a photograph of the day that they invaded in 1975 and began to set up, more people would arrive throughout the day, began to set up homes in what's known as the Primero de Mayo land invasion.
Hi, I'm so sorry to interrupt. I think I left something here earlier. Do you mind if I just check?
I guess so, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, thank you.
The reason I've got this particular slide up, and I think it's interesting, is because this is 1975. The Primero de Mayo, or the 1st of May, or the May 1st, it's no coincidence that they've chosen that name to honor workers' struggles as May Day, would become the most important base for urban guerrilla militia in the city. In a neighborhood that was so stigmatized by the presence of urban guerrillas that it was also the first to really receive the lash of counterinsurgency in the 1980s. And these were some of the pioneers who, before the guerrillas were a presence, were part of building that community.
I'm sure you were not there in 75. So
No, sir, I was not. I was not. The photograph was given to me by a local historian named Jorge Nunez, who has worked with the mayor's office in Barrancabermeja to collect archives of the period. Another Joya photograph, quickly. This is a picture of going forward in time now to the end of the 1970s of a important national politician, Horacio Serpa, shaking hands with the president of Colombia, Julio Cesar Turbay Ayala, At the airport in Barrancabermeja, you can see perhaps implied from Serpa's expression that he's not exactly ecstatic to receive Turbay Ayala. Although a liberal, Turbay Ayala was responsible for implementing a national security policy that would cede power in many parts of the country, governing power, to the military, among other things. And Horacio Serpa, being from Barrancabermeja, was part of a generation of people really who was raised up through the power of social movements. He wouldn't always maybe maintain those links, but at this juncture he certainly was still dependent upon that kind of local radical politics. So that was the scene in 1979. Later on, this is a quote from the president of the Popular Women's Organization, who I interviewed as well. Her name is Yolanda Becerra, and she is describing what it was like, so in the early 1980s, when the city itself was really flush with the energy of social movements. And this is an amazing quotation to me. She says, "I got married in 81 and I didn't have children until 84 because I thought that social change was about to happen. I didn't want to be tied down raising children because we didn't see it happening tomorrow. It was going to happen today. This motivated us and made us strong, dreaming of the world of many things." Becerra is describing the feeling of effervescence in the social movements in the early 1980s, what was at stake, if you will, and how she felt that the revolution, albeit a nonviolent revolution for her, was coming quickly, and she needed to be prepared for that. This would be reflected in the spread of national liberation movements elsewhere in Latin America, and their ideas and their dreams were echoed, by the Sandinistas and others to whom they looked for inspiration as well. I mentioned earlier the Patriotic Union, the political party of the associated with the FARC guerrillas. There's a 1985, there's a meeting of the Patriotic Union in Barrancabermeja. I just wanted to give you a sense of what it meant to stand up, the Sinn Féin, if you will, of Colombia, to stand up and somehow in the defense of very radical politics, an attempt to contest elections legally, right, with some of the same inspiration. Now, I should point out, by no means was everyone in the Patriotic Union associated with the FARC, not at all. Many of them adhered to the movement because they saw a possibility of change. They were not necessarily sympathizers with the FARC, but they wanted to have options. And many of these individuals would be the very first people targeted by paramilitary violence in the city. Just that picture. Anyway, really quickly running in through it today, this is a picture of a paro cívico or the barricades in a civic strike from 1988. But this is the actual paro cívico por la vida, or the human rights general strike that I described at the outset. And I wanted to give you a sense of, at least, it was a grainy image, mind you, but a sense of what that looked like. And just in case you thought it was all about taking over the streets, municipal politics in the city were also the source of important power struggles. And this is a standing room only city council meeting from 1988, the same year. So people were heavily invested in the democratic process. It wasn't all about burning tires and upsetting the powers that be. They actually wanted to participate in politics. And again, this is a Hoya photograph from the same photographer. And I think he beautifully captures what that looked like circa 1988. And finally, this is the publication of a report on the first major meeting that takes place in the city around human rights, that hundreds of people from all over the region and people from as far away as Canada and Switzerland came to partake in 1989. What's curious about this particular meeting is that amongst the people who were present at the meeting were in fact delegates from many branches of the Colombian state and both of Colombia's main guerrilla organizations. And they all spoke to the plenary. This kind of coming together of sworn enemies wouldn't happen very often afterwards. In fact, the Colombian government's commitment to human rights, which was very strong on paper, would really retreat in subsequent years. This very same year, a delegation of investigators from the Attorney General's office, it was called something else at the time, but from the Colombian judiciary, was massacred by paramilitaries and the army in 1989 in a town about 30 kilometers from Barrancabermeja for sticking their nose in and trying to investigate paramilitary crimes. Needless to say, it put a chill on government efforts to investigate human rights, and it was really left to people like the unions and Kratos and others to try and document what was happening, which they would do for the next decades. I'd have so much more I'd love to share with you, but I also want to have the opportunity to do that through interaction. So thank you very much for your patience, for listening to the full story, and thank you so much for being here tonight.